To the webinar, the Taliban endorsed Trump, American choices in Afghanistan's peace process. In short, what we're talking about here today is the future of the peace negotiations or the intra-Afghan talks that are taking place in Afghanistan between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. One specific interest we have, for those of you that have read the information that we circulated in advance, is what policy steps the incoming US administration should take once President-elect Biden comes into office. Now, I should add that we're assuming that given the way that the talks are currently stalling, and we assume that people are going to be waiting to kind of see how the US administration's position pivots, to what extent, if at all. So we're assuming that very little is going to take place before we move into, the January 20th inauguration of Biden moving forward. We have two great speakers here with us today, Hamish Falconer and Mohammad Musa Mahmodi, who I'm very excited to introduce in a moment to you. But I just wanted to say as well that this is a panel sponsored by the Council of Middle East Studies and co-hosted by the Yale program in Iranian Studies. So I'd like to thank Professor Marcia Inhorn, Kristen Siebert, Marwa Kabur from CMES, the Council, and Professor Abbas Amanat and Farbad Honapishe from Yale program in Iranian Studies. My name is Dr. Naysan Adlparvar. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a lecturer at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs here at Yale, and a large part of my work focuses on Afghanistan. Before we move into the kind of content and substance of the webinar, I just wanted to talk through a few quick processual points. So in terms of kind of process and schedule, we do have an hour and a half. I'm going through the introduction now, but I've invited both of the speakers to talk for 15 minutes. Hamish will speak first, followed by Musa. And then we thought we'd have a discussion, perhaps for around 15, 20 minutes, just to tease out a few of the key points that come from their presentations. And then, of course, we're going to open it to Q&A to the audience to pose questions for our speakers. Now, it's my job to curate those questions from the audience. So I do invite you during and after the presentations and during the discussion to share your questions and to do that using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. I'll then do my best to sift through the questions and then share them with the panelists for their response. Before I do introduce our speakers, I want to draw your attention to an article that Hamish and Musa have very recently published on November the 2nd in World Politics Review. And that's on the topic of this panel and really was the kind of the seed idea for the panel itself. It's titled, "The Next US President Will Face Hard Choices in Afghanistan." And once the presentations are underway, I'm going to post a link in the chat box to everyone so that you can access that. You will be asked to submit an email address when you follow that link, and then you should get free access to the article that they wrote. And I'd highly recommend it. It's a great supplement to what we're talking about today. But now to the exciting part. Let me introduce our speakers. They are both 2020 Maurice R. Greenberg World Fellows. So we have them for a term. We're very lucky to have them and to have them participate in events like this and to work with the students. Hamish Falconer is a former member of the British Diplomatic Service. He's led the Foreign Office's terrorism response team, UK efforts to start a peace process in Afghanistan, which is obviously very key, and has served in Pakistan and South Sudan. He has worked for the UK's Department for International Development and the National Crime Agency on humanitarian response, state building, and human trafficking investigations. And before joining the government service, he was both a campaigner and an activist, and he studied at both Cambridge and Birkbeck universities in the UK. Mohammad Musa Mahmodi is a human rights lawyer and defender based in Kabul. He served as the executive director of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission for a decade. It's no easy task. And as part of his work, he focused on transitional justice, women's rights, children's rights, human rights education writ large, and investigations of human rights violations and abuses by all parties to the conflict in Afghanistan. He previously worked with the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, where he led and ran programs strengthening democracy on political parties in Afghanistan. At the time, that was the largest NDI program in the world. Again, no easy task. Musa held a law degree from Kabul University, and in 2007 was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to study at Syracuse University for his master's degree. They've both asked me to point out that today they're speaking in a personal capacity and not representing any organizations they currently or have worked with previously. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Hamish to open with a bit of a backgrounder on the peace negotiations and to address what he thinks the Biden administration should focus on moving forward. Hamish, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Naysan, and great to be with you all today. Thanks to Yale for putting on this event. So I wanted to say three things today. Firstly, to take note of the journey which has brought us here to the current state of the Afghan conflict and its stalled peace process. Secondly, to look at the frame of the deal which the Biden administration will inherit. And finally, to offer some personal observations on what might be done by Biden's administration to try to improve the prospects for a more sustainable reduction in violence in Afghanistan. And I want to apologize in advance because this is going to be account very much from a Western perspective, because I think that's particularly relevant to thinking about the shape of US choices. But I think the crossroads that Afghanistan is facing is in essence whether it will see the restoration of the Taliban's emirate, fundamentally the authoritarian theocracy that ruled Afghanistan in the mid-90s, or whether the Islamic Republic, its current government, can endure. In my view, there are more Afghans who support the Republic than the Emirate, and it's only they and their political and military leaders who will ultimately be able to determine Afghanistan's future. But Musa will say a little bit more about that. So, back to America. What is Afghanistan to America? Well, it's now America's longest ever war. It initially commanded overwhelming public and international support, and it was the first ever invocation of NATO's Article of Collective Self-Defense. At outset, this war was felt to be an enlightened project about making a better world. Even human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch were encouraging the US military in 2003 to expand its presence beyond Kabul and to the rest of the country. The Taliban were initially removed from power by CIA-supported Afghan warlords, and they were defeated almost totally. There's a lively debate about whether in this period original sins were made, fatal to the subsequent course of the war. Did the CIA empower the wrong warlords? Was ignorant Western power used to settle local Afghan feuds? Did the sudden enormous inflow of foreign money create overwhelming temptation for corruption? Was an opportunity to make peace with the Taliban missed in the early days? Was Hamid Karzai a disastrous leader? Whatever your view on which of those potential mistakes might have been made or been most significant, it was clear by the mid-2000s that American and international desire to transform the country was struggling to make progress, and that the growing Taliban insurgency was durable and could draw support from a growing section of the country. Analysts started to see the importance of a political resolution to the conflict. Making successful contact with the Taliban, however, in order to negotiate was tricky, and a number of embarrassing mistakes were made, not least a British effort to negotiate with a greengrocer claiming to be a senior Talib figure. But contact began, and I think it's worth dwelling on the three primary issues that emerged right from the very outset, because I think those are the three issues which remain fundamental. The first relates to the West's concern about terrorists and the Taliban concern about American and Western troops in Afghanistan. There is basic agreement, as the Taliban reiterated in a statement yesterday, that the nub of any Western Talib agreement is that the Taliban will prevent Afghanistan being used as a safe haven for terrorists in return for the complete departure of international troops. The problem with this formulation, which even Zalmay Khalilzad, the architect of the deal, acknowledges, is that we know there are still al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan. The Taliban haven't kicked them out yet, and the fewer troops you have, the less intelligence machinery, the less effectively you'll be able to monitor this threat. Now, in the Taliban's defense, you can make a plausible argument that many of them bitterly regret continuing to host Osama bin Laden, as that led eventually to their removal. And they have fought ISKP, Daesh's Afghan branch, earnestly. But honestly, these are pretty thin reeds to rest Western security upon. In my personal view, it is very plausible to imagine an enduring terrorism threat being projected from Afghanistan under the current contours of this deal. So that's terrorism. What about US troops? Well, the Taliban position is that 0 is the only acceptable figure. Previously, there had been some hints of greater Taliban flexibility. Perhaps if the soldiers are acting as diplomats in the embassy, they could be there. But this is now presented as a Taliban red line. I'll say a little bit more about what that means for Biden's desire to have a sustained counter-terrorism force there shortly. So, foreign fighters, these two linked issues, has been the very center of negotiations so far. But there are two other fundamental issues that are now the subject of inter-Afghan talks. The most fundamental, and this goes right to the very heart of the difference between an Islamic emirate and a republic in Afghanistan, is how power might be shared. The Taliban's starting position is that the Afghan government is fundamentally illegitimate and is not a relevant negotiating partner. Rhetorically, they recognize that they can't monopolize power. Previously, this seemed like a potential area for wiggle room. Thoughtful Taliban seem to recognize that while they would not be bought by being offered ministries to run, they needed to think hard about what the models of coexistence might be. But I think that trail has gone cold. I don't see many signs of debate within the Taliban about this, only an expectation of victory and scorn for the Afghan government's corruption and political dysfunction. A linked issue to that is the question of human rights in Afghanistan. In my view, there's never been a very productive conversation about this between the Taliban and Westerners. It always descends into an acrimonious debate about whether Afghan and American or Taliban forces commit more abuses. So those three pillars, in my view, foreign forces, sharing power, and human rights, are the fundamental pillars of the negotiation. But given the difficulties I've described in all three of them, how have we made the progress we have to get here to a process, stalled though it is? Well, the primary move, in my view, that unlocked progress was American capitulation on power sharing and human rights. Trump's administration effectively removed the Kabul government's veto on separate negotiations between the Americans and the Taliban. And in doing so, they delinked the US troop withdrawal, a key concern of the Taliban, from questions of Afghanistan's future government structure. By accepting that the foreign forces issues could be resolved separately from the other two, the US set out its clear priorities for departure. This created, for the first time, the possibility that America could acquiesce to the return of the Taliban government it removed in 2002, after $2 trillion have been spent and more than 2,000 US soldiers killed. Issues of rights and violence reduction were basically left to the Taliban and the government to resolve. There's been little progress in those inter-Afghan negotiations. I think it's hard to look at the Taliban approach and take much confidence that this is a serious effort to find common ground. Particularly provocative in the early period of negotiations was the Taliban insistence that Sunni jurisprudence would be superior to Shia jurisprudence during the negotiations. This is a painfully provocative approach to the Hazara Shia minority who suffered badly under the Taliban regime. So, what real-world consequences flow from this analysis? I think that if you assume that the basic frame of the talks will remain, and if, like most analysts, you are pessimistic about the Afghan's military's performance without US support, then you have to assume that the Afghan government will either basically capitulate or be defeated militarily, and that the Taliban will restore themselves to power either directly or through some kind of interim government as a cutout for a while. Sorry, a cutout is a very government phrase. That means an interim government in charge, but the Taliban really holding all the cards and all the power. The Taliban might not call any Talib-dominated government the Islamic Emirate, but I think their approach to the negotiations suggests that they will still take a fundamentally authoritarian approach and that they will not share power. So, Afghanistan will become a repressive theocracy. It's an obvious thing to say, but that would be a very big defeat for America, for NATO, and the West. You could certainly expect Pakistan, Russia, and Iran at least to increase their influence through their links into the Taliban. The same is true, though in a different way, with China, whose Belt and Road Initiative passes next to Afghanistan. But the restoration of the emirate would not be welcomed by the region. While they may be able to buy influence in certain areas from Taliban cadres, they have bitter memories of how difficult the emirate was to deal with in the 90s. And the Pakistanis in particular fear the impact on their own domestic constituencies. But more fundamentally than that, Afghanistan has a history of producing dynamic and effective insurgencies against every government the current country has had since the Soviets first invaded. Afghanistan's neighbors, and indeed we, would expect that a Taliban restoration is as likely to be a new chapter of insurgency led by those shunted out of power, rather than an end to Afghanistan's long period of violence. When we named this talk, we chose a controversial title. We wanted to draw attention to the strength of Taliban views. They see the current Trump-led process and the new sequence of negotiations it brought as being pretty close to ideal for them. They are ahead of much of the Republican Party, but they only just yesterday were prepared to acknowledge that Trump has been defeated. So, what might Biden do? Well, firstly, he says he's committed to an enduring counter-terrorism troop presence in Afghanistan, i.e. that he will insist on some American troops remaining in the country. Three obvious questions emerge from that. Can the Taliban accept that? Could those troops operate without a local partner if the Afghan government starts to fall to the Taliban? Could the Taliban even be that partner? This could, in my view, force a pretty significant rupture in the talks, though the Taliban might judge that they can live initially with a small American force if they believe they could ultimately eject it at a time of their choosing. Secondly, Biden is skeptical that America can or should be expending too much blood or treasure in pursuit of Afghan human rights. He famously said his son was not deploying to Afghanistan to get girls into school. That just wouldn't work. He will also remember the frustration that the Obama administration felt with the current crop of Afghan political leaders. So in summary, there is much here that looks familiar in the Biden approach, but there's one fundamental difference with the Trump approach, which could end up upending the current frame of the talks. So this would be my advice to Biden and his team. Firstly, these negotiations must be rebalanced. The Taliban must think harder about how to share power if violence is to be reduced. They believe they are on the verge of victory, and so they don't have to worry about explaining to their base, to their soldiers, what will need to change if they are to return to power. They must be disabused of that confidence by enough support to Kabul as is necessary to burst their bubble on the battlefield. Secondly, the internal politics of the Taliban is not monolithic, and it has to be made to engage with the realities of a peace process if that process is going to prove durable. The Taliban should be pressed to do further confidence-building measures to demonstrate their seriousness in this area. And the West, with Kabul, should start a program of engagement with those more moderate cadres of the Taliban, such as some of its Uzbek or Tajik elements, who fear being dominated by the Taliban's Pashtun leadership. And just a word more on that. Iran and Russia have demonstrated that they are effective at creating political relationships with various cadres within the Taliban. The CIA and State Department should be instructed to do the same. America needs to be as imaginative as the Iranians, who it looks, and this is absolutely fascinating to me, it looks like they were running a cyber influence campaign via Facebook aimed at Taliban constituencies, criticizing the US talks, emphasizing the importance of women's rights, and playing up the role of Iran in Afghanistan's future. The diplomacy in hotel rooms that Khalilzad has been engaged in is important, but the West needs to be thinking like the region about how you shift the narrative within the Taliban, as well as in negotiations with its top leadership. Finally, America needs to corral a strong regional message to the Taliban that nobody supports their straightforward restoration. This is the true position of even Pakistan, Iran, and China. But the Talibs, in the face of Trump's approach, have fooled themselves that they've escaped the reputational problems of their past. They have not. Now, as I said at the beginning, these 3 steps are marginal. The truth is that only the proven durability of the Afghan government can persuade the Taliban to deal seriously with them. I think in the past, there may have been better reasons for the West to risk the restoration of the Taliban, believing that they'd grown more politically pluralist in their opposition. But their approach to the negotiations has shattered those hopes. That ultimately means that however wearying the prospect is, America's role in the future of these talks will be as important, if not more so, than its long years of bloody and expensive fighting. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Hamish. That was both far-reaching and very concise at the same time. So I think that was a really good introduction and a key discussion of points. It's opened up a lot of questions for me, particularly on the Taliban position, the way you've described it, and the steps that need to be taken moving forward. Those questions will have to wait for the discussion, but I guess that's where I want to go. And just as a reminder to the audience before I hand over to Musa, that if there are any questions that have been generated by what Hamish has just said, please, or what Musa is about to say, please do pop those in the Q&A box, and I'll look at those later on. But now to hand over to Musa, who'll talk on the same issue, but with a slightly broader focus, on what a peace agreement means moving forward with the Taliban. Musa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Naysan. Good to be here with you all. Thank you, Hamish, for setting the scene and your remark. Afghanistan conflict is not in the center of the US foreign policy anymore, apparently, but it defines the longest military engagement of the US since the Vietnam War. The US may have found the battleground lost or no longer viable for a victory. It certainly cannot disengage from it without coordination and partnership with Afghans, NATO, and other partners, and should do it responsibly. Therefore, I'm going to discuss and raise the following points: peace process, counter-terrorism, democracy and human rights, expectation from the new administration, and accountability, all from Afghan point of view. First, the peace. The current peace process between Taliban and government of Afghanistan is an important opportunity to end the conflict, this 43 years conflict. The two parties are now in Doha since September 12th to negotiate, find a way to ceasefire and reach a peace deal. It seems, however, that the process is not going forward and is stalled because of many reasons, chief among them the February agreement between the US and Taliban, which one-sidedly favored Taliban without the Taliban conceding to any concrete and tangible commitments toward peace and ending violence. Taliban are just awaiting full withdrawal of the US troops, so they further their gains and political outcomes through intensified violence. Unfortunately, during the course of the negotiations, Taliban has not agreed to cease violence or reduce it to a substantial level. The recent attacks in Kabul, Kandahar, Kunduz, Helmand, and Ghazni show that the victims of this continued violence is people, and the question of how the release of 5,000 prisoners and a talk with Taliban would help to bring peace is repeatedly asked and spun around in the media and cited by the politicians. The peace, as we have witnessed in the past, and more strikingly, a similar situation after the Soviet Union signing the Geneva Accord in 1998, might not be achieved through negotiations and exclusion of one party from the accord. The peace might become only a wish of Afghan citizens and political rhetoric of the parties to conflict to play with. Neither the total capitulation of Dr. Najibullah and victory of Mujahideen through violence ended conflict in Afghanistan, nor the Mujahideen agreement signed in Mecca and Islamabad brought peace to Afghanistan. All we remember from that experience is that the conflict just intensified in different forms and ways. So, and therefore, I'm of the view that if the US does not continue and ensure its support to a new and not very united, weak, fragile government of Afghanistan, Taliban and its allies in the region do not see an incentive to agree to anything short of capitulation of the current government. This might be dangerous and a recipe for continuation of the conflict in Afghanistan. Another cause of this conflict is the opposite views, ideologies, values, and principles which contribute to the stallment of negotiations. For the Taliban, it's Islam, end of so-called occupation, a pure Islamic government, and Taliban power. What that is matter. For the government, it is the continuation which defines is the constitution which continuation of constitution which defines Afghanistan as Islamic country, republic, and also adhere to human rights, equality of men and women, representative democracy, civil rule of law, and an independent judiciary. I cannot dismiss this desire of some politicians to stay in power, which is another issue and could be discussed in its own merit. Second, on counter-terrorism, a counter-terrorism strategy to succeed in Afghanistan requires long-term and effective ongoing programs and a viable military, security, and economic approach, and effective cooperation between the government of Afghanistan and the US in one hand, and the international and regional communities on the other. Relying on or outsourcing counter-terrorism efforts to Taliban or Pakistan may seem attainable through current state of affairs. But I'm afraid and I believe it would badly turn to another disaster, the like that we witnessed in Iraq or Syria, emerge of new terrorist groups and forces, and this time destabilizing the region, most notably Central Asia. Worse would also be possible with an attack elsewhere in the world. We should heed to the reports that Taliban has not severed its tie with Al-Qaeda, and it's challenged by the emerging new terrorist forces in the region. Taliban also may not be cohesive and united as they tend to portray themselves, and are divided in confronting their ideological brethren, especially when the hardliners are being trained and staying in safe sanctuaries unrestricted. Afghans have shown interest and commitment to uphold democracy and poised for promotion and protection of human rights, women's rights, and political and individual freedoms, universal education, democracy, market economy, and a free and open society. They have made progress and achieved some milestones by the support of, and in collaboration with the international community. So I think they are expecting the international community to remain engaged and support them to hold on and carry consistently on the path they have been pursuing toward a stable, democratic, free, and peaceful and prosperous country. As Madeleine Albright once mentioned, democracy is among the most fragile system or form of government in short run and the most stable in the long run. Also, as Bruce Ackerman, the constitutional law professor, said at his class that I'm auditing, the average constitution lasts 27 years. And I think that makes the difference. And it is the age of democracies to hold and become stable. So we require that threshold for Afghanistan and its constitution. It is remarkable to see that the current constitution is the longest age constitution ever approved in Afghanistan in the last 100 years. Therefore, any threats toward this nascent democracy by any form of theocracy pushed by Taliban should be dealt with and neutralized. The will of a minority group resorting to violence should not be allowed to be imposed on Afghans because it will cause further conflict. There is a particular expectation from the new administration. People in Afghanistan will not see the president-elect Biden to measure the success or failure in Afghanistan by monetary cost of the engagement, but more broadly on the greater picture of national security, future of cooperation with allies, and being responsible to end a conflict that the US has been a party to. In this regard, I believe that Biden administration might have to review both the Obama administration and Trump administration policies towards Afghanistan and South Asia. They might need to come back with a long-term strategic plan supporting Afghanistan's democratic security and defense institutions, putting pressure on and cooperate with all countries in the region, including cooperation with India and Pakistan, is key to help Afghanistan to get to stability. Afghanistan is a rich country in terms of its untapped and unexcavated natural resources and mines. The country can be a crossroads for trades and transactions of goods and services between South Asia, Central Asia, and link China to Middle East. It, however, requires long-term support, security, and more importantly, foreign investors and their trust so the country could benefit from its natural resources. I think for the short to mid-term, Afghanistan will need to receive aid monies and fundings to sustain its government and provide public services and security. And again, Afghanistan men and women are working hard to bring peace in Afghanistan through sacrificing on different fronts, through providing security, fighting terrorism, public services, civil society work, defending human rights, economic activities, participation in elections, and doing their civic duties. But corruption, discrimination, weak rule of law, and accountability system is hindering their efforts. We need and we have to work on fighting corruption and human rights violations and in discrimination and ethnic divides in Afghanistan. We should invest on good governance, rule of law, respect human rights, and independent justice system and accountability. Talking about accountability, I also think that accountability mechanism must be established to bring parties to conflict to account for the crimes and human rights violations they have committed. For example, Taliban and ISIS have committed war crimes, crimes against humanity. They must be held accountable for those crimes, and a transitional justice and accountability system must be in place. Afghan and international forces also should be held accountable for the violations they have committed. Women and victims must be given a priority and to be heard. And I believe peace without justice and accountability may not last long, especially in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Musa. That was very informative, and it's great to get kind of a detailed experience, to share your detailed expertise of what's taking place in the country and the implications moving forward. I want to just move now into the discussion and pick up a few threads of points that you've mentioned. But again, just a quick reminder, any questions that are generated by the presentations or from this discussion, please do pop it in the Q&A box and I'll attend to those afterwards. You've both outlined a number of elements that I think of what is a very complicated issue. But what I take away broadly from what you're both saying is that you're both very pessimistic about the prospects of a peaceful Afghanistan that doesn't suffer under a future Taliban or Taliban administered state. You're describing two fractured parties with very opposing perspectives that are going to be hard to reconcile. Hamish in particular, but both of you have talked about little compromise on the part of the Taliban. You're both advocating for limited or compromises, if any, on the part of human rights, women's rights, the constitution, and progress that's been made in the country. I guess my question to both of you, and I'll invite Musa to talk first, given his experience on human rights issues in the country, is how feasible is it to take such a standpoint? I don't think anyone would disagree with you, but how feasible is it to take such a standpoint? How do we approach peace negotiations, or how should the Biden administration attempt to influence or frame negotiations in which the Taliban are going to be expecting some of these issues to be put on the table? Or perhaps they don't. Perhaps your perspective is that afterwards they're in a position in which they simply do what they want after they've secured some sort of political settlement. So I guess to Musa, what's your standpoint on these compromises? How feasible do you think it is to keep them off the table? What would happen in the negotiations with the Taliban in terms of moving to a peace negotiation and their expectations?
I think, and I will touch on the human rights and women rights issues. Maybe Hamish will point on a broader aspect on this issue. Afghanistan is party to 7 major international human rights instruments or international human rights covenants. And as I state, any parties, if want to share power or negotiate, they must abide by that obligations and honor that obligations. And I think it's not an issue of negotiating on the in Doha, that how much human rights people of Afghanistan would have or not have, but it's most importantly that how they are going to honor and implement its obligation under international law as well as the Constitution of Afghanistan. And if we want to be an active member of the international community, whether it is a shared power or the current government or a changed government, an interim government, it is a requirement that as a member of international community, we have to abide by the international human rights law, and that's an imperative. So there is no way that this is my view, that we cannot negotiate and put human rights and women rights as a agenda in the agenda of negotiation. It must be more a framework or cross-cutting issues that inform and guide all the other discussions that we would have on sharing powers, on other forms of government.
Okay, thank you. Hamish.
Naysan, I think it's such an interesting question. I mean, I would maybe slightly finesse the question in that, I mean, my assessment of the talk so far is that human rights have not been, human rights are not a reason that the talks are stalled. And in fact, I don't think that either Western interlocutors or Afghan government interlocutors have really ever got into a very serious discussion about human rights. We're still quite a long way away from the kind of detailed negotiations that might involve discussion about what the provisions of a new constitution or a new legal framework should look like. So I think the Afghan government isn't yet facing hard choices about human rights. It may do in the future. I think your question about can the Republic retain all of the things that we think are very important and conclude a successful negotiation with the Taliban is a really good one. I mean, I think that it probably can't. And I think that if a process is to be successful, then both sides are going to have to negotiate on some pretty fundamental questions of difficulty. Why I feel pessimistic is not actually because I think that the Afghan government are being asked to give up difficult questions of principle or ideology. It's because I think that as far as I can tell, the Taliban have not yet had a serious internal discussion about what power sharing would look like. And if they have not had a serious internal discussion about what power sharing would look like, then they're not going to be able to politically pull it off within the movement. I mean, we saw in Northern Ireland that there was a long, difficult debate within the Republican parties about what power sharing might look like, and that was a necessary prelude to an eventual peace process. And in fact, when you speak to the parties to that conflict, they say the internal negotiations were much harder than the external negotiations. I mean, speaking as a former diplomat, usually once you get into the room with another diplomat, you both want a deal. That's what you're there for. The internal politics of this, I think, will be much more difficult. So my pessimism doesn't really relate to what hard things must Kabul give up. It more relates to a judgment that the Taliban are not even at the races at the moment on these questions.
So I guess based on those two questions, if we go back to the focus of the webinar, and I'll start with you, Hamish, based on what you've just said. What is it the Biden administration can do? And it's fine to reiterate earlier points, but I think to tease them out is very important. What is it that a Biden administration should be doing to try to ensure that we're in a position moving forward of the type that you are advocating for? Particularly if there's going to be challenging internal discussions, how do they set the frame? Do they have a role to play beyond the sorts of things you talked about earlier? And I'll ask Musa to comment afterwards.
So I think there's three main things. The first is that, and this is, I mean, as you mentioned at the beginning, I was heavily engaged in efforts to try and start a peace process. So this is a rather counterintuitive thing for me to say, but I do think that Taliban expectations need to be reset a little bit. And it is true that the Afghan army has had many reverses, but the truth is that this is largely an Afghan war now. There are American airstrikes, which are important, and some other American support, which is important, but this is primarily an Afghan conflict. And the Taliban need to, their internal narrative needs to change from we've defeated the Americans and we're just about to sweep to power to we are in a long and painful war with other Afghans, because I think it's only that frame of mind that can get you to the next step, which is to think about what are the compromises that might need to be made in order to have a Afghanistan which is not so susceptible to foreign influence as it currently is. I think there was a repulsion on both sides of the Afghan conflict that the Afghan government is so dependent on the West and that the Taliban have been so dependent on Pakistan and various other regional players. And I think once you have got to a stage that that truth is more evident, peace process will be easier. So I think that by simply saying, actually, we're not going to leave until there have been serious talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban, that we can sustain the amount of military support we've got to Afghanistan. It's not really that big a deal. We'll continue to pay $5 billion a year for the Afghan army. It sounds like a big number, but it's only 10% of America's overseas aid annually. That, I think, would help reset expectations. The other thing I think that Biden needs to do is to just get much more, and then again, another very counterintuitive thing for a British diplomat to say, but I think we need to get much more Iranian about the way in which we deal with the Taliban. So there has been a tendency to deal with the Taliban as though they are a monolith, and intelligence efforts. We've got a question in the Q&A about how knowable are the Taliban, and I think that they're not fundamentally unknowable. We have often misjudged them, and debates about how splintered or not splintered are quite difficult. But they're difficult in the way that making those assessments of any political organization is hard. I don't think that an experienced American political analyst looking at the Republican Party now would be able to make a definitive judgment about how much division there is within that movement. It's what one of my old colleagues would say, a mystery rather than a secret. That truth doesn't exist in a box hidden in a safe. It's something which is to some degree unknowable. Mm-hmm. And I think what is clear from the way that the Iranians, the Russians, the Pakistanis operate within the Taliban is that there are different constituencies within the Taliban. There are non-Pashtun Taliban who have a slightly different view of the world, as you'd expect from the different geographies and traditions that they come from. They are the Pashtuns from the non-dominant tribes within the Taliban. So if you're an Eastern Pashtun and you're not part of the Haqqanis, then you've basically been sidelined over the last 10 years. And so you probably have a different view about what the future of governance in Eastern Afghanistan should be amongst the Pashtuns than, say, the Haqqani network would. And I think that we have to get much more Iranian about this and try and start a dialogue which is not a human intelligence instrumental dialogue designed to enable drone strikes or secret reports about the inner truth about the Taliban, but to try and flesh out what the range of political views within the Taliban are about what the future might look like. Because there is, after hundreds, if not thousands of hours of talks with Taliban negotiators, that a true position about what they can live with has not yet emerged. And I think that one of the things you see in peace processes everywhere is that the more contact you can have throughout the range of the movement, the better positioned you will be in to be able to identify what the compromises will be. So those would be the two main recommendations I would make.
Thanks, Hamish. I guess to you, Musa, the same question about what, if at all, the Biden administration can do in preparation for some of these more difficult discussions, if and when we have to broach them, in terms of the Constitution and some of the human rights and women's rights, some of the progress that's been made that you've worked so closely on. But I guess also, based on what Hamish was just saying, what is it that has to happen perhaps internally in the Afghan government or among Afghan actors in preparation for that discussion with the Taliban?
Well, thank you very much. I think the new administration might have several choices. They can engage in three areas. One is a negotiation. I think this negotiation still is an opportunity to end conflict in Afghanistan, but they have to change the narratives of Taliban from a total victory to something that they are agreed under the pressure that's to negotiate and share power. In that regard, the first pressure must be put on Taliban to agree on ceasefire and ending violence immediately, as opposed to reduction of violence, which is not measurable. So that must be a first priority. If Taliban agrees on an immediate ceasefire, I think the negotiation might find a way to go forward. Second, the cooperation and coordination with the Afghan government and Afghanistan people, civil society, must continue, so we can achieve some of the milestones that were set there, and we have failed to do that, on good governance, on upholding constitution, on holding the officials accountable, on ending and fighting corruption seriously, not the way that Sigar recently wrote a letter that said that fighting corruption is only on paper and not really in actual deed and action. So that must be done, and I think that, as I mentioned, that we need a little bit of time to allow democracy and the current constitution to take root and become stable, so we can put accountability in place there. The third choice of it should be done by the new administration to engage more broadly in the region with different partners, adversaries, as well as enemies. I think that is a very important point. There are opportunities to work with the partners in the region, with adversaries in the region, and probably, neutralizing the enemies that the US and Afghanistan have in the region. So these three approaches might be helpful in making and ensuring that all the resources available is mobilized towards peace, not only focusing on Taliban, but preparing the ground for peace. So what are the incentives for Afghans to be ready for peace? For what outlook of the economic development and reconstruction would look like? This kind of policies and program must be explained and translated into the common understanding of people. One of the problems that the US has had always, that it hasn't been able to translate its messages to the understanding of common people in Afghanistan.
I'm going to just shift slightly. I've got two more key questions really I wanted to broach. This one goes back to Hamish. There's been discussion about the, let's say, the uncompromising position the Taliban you spoke about. I know you specifically said that particularly in the peace negotiations, their position has really hardened. And you've implied that they haven't really, to some extent, you implied that they haven't really evolved on their standpoint, engaging the international community, or, you know, ruling a new Afghanistan with the social changes that we've seen unfold since 2001. Might the Taliban position simply be because they feel that they're emboldened? That's what you've implied. But then there are many observers, you know, in Afghanistan that believe that they have adapted. They understand now about what they need to do to get international support by virtue of what's taking place now. And they understand that they have to kind of incorporate this kind of the new social, political, even economic realities of contemporary Afghanistan. So my question is, on one hand, you're implying that they're not compromising much, but you're implying that they need to moving forwards. If you could just kind of elaborate on that point, I think it'd be useful, because there's a bit of a tension there.
I think it's a great question. And so I think that they have got much better at engaging with the international community. I think their diplomats in the Taliban Political Commission are now very sophisticated. I mean, when if you look at their website and their statements, they are, I'm afraid, often much more capable than the Afghan government at running a negotiation, holding a line, working out where the rest of the international community will be, and appealing to that. I guess the area in which, there is plenty in what they have said, whether it's in conferences or on their website or in statements or in media interviews, which could be room for thinking that they have changed. And it's, you know, you can't escape the fact that they used to ban music and video, and now they have videos with music hosted on their website. So they clearly have changed since the mid-90s. But I think the reason why I still remain fundamentally pessimistic about the extent of that change is that when you look at how they are describing their politics, I can't see that they have gone beyond the fundamental principle that Afghan government needs to be based on obedience to the emir. So that's the name. Obedience to the emir is the name of the political text that Mullah Omar, the founder and leader of the Taliban, used to give out to visitors, saying, if you want to understand how the Taliban work, it's obedience to the emir. That's clearly a pretty authoritarian way of being. The emir is not elected. There's no way of removing them. That's not compatible with a democratic republic, which is what Afghanistan's become. And I think if they were prepared to move away from an emirate, if they were prepared to move away from obedience to the emir, they would say so, because it's such a fundamental issue. And if they were prepared to shift on that, then that would make so many other things so much easier. But I don't see any sign of them doing it. And if they were to do it, they would need to explain to their people, to their fighters, to their commanders, how moving away from the fundamental principles of the Taliban is consistent with the jihad that they have fought and which they've spent huge amounts of blood and treasure on. And so it's that, I guess there's a distinction between, have they changed on some issues? Yes, they have. Have they changed on the fundamental issue of authoritarianism? Not as far as I can tell.
Thanks. That was good clarification. Musa, I've got one question to put to you, actually, and we've got 3 or 4 minutes left before we switch to the Q&A. And this really focuses more on, well, you talked about holding the Taliban to account moving forward. You both did, but Musa specifically. Again, it's more a question of moving forward with these negotiations, which to some degree we hope will happen in a positive trajectory. But alongside of that, transitional justice, that's something I assume you're advocating for, holding the Taliban to account. Is that possible to have these two twin tracks at the same time? Is the Taliban really going to let themselves be held to account if they're expecting to be forming or taking control of the country in the future, or at least agreeing a political settlement? We've seen post-2001 transitional justice taking a back seat, exceptions being made with some of the warlords in the country. I guess what's your reading of that moving forward, and how viable is it to want to do both? Or maybe that's not what you're advocating. Just please explain your point further.
Well, thank you very much. I think accountability mechanism and justice must be an important part of peace and negotiation. And without that, we have seen in Afghanistan that we will not have a lasting peace, because what we have been missing is that this accountability for the crimes and human rights violations that parties to the conflict, the previous conflict, committed. So we have to learn a lesson, and it's not about only Taliban, but it's about the Afghan forces and international community. So we are advocating for all sides and parties to the conflict that they should be held accountable for the crimes and human rights violations they committed during the course of war and conflict in Afghanistan. There are issues of victims. If you look at the statistics and numbers of civilian casualties, it's more than 200,000 people, registered. Unregistered might mount higher than that number. So those victims need to have an understanding, an explanation why this happened, and then suddenly everything has changed, and all those committed crimes are in power, as they witnessed in previous transition of power in Afghanistan. So we have to be respectful to the demand and the plights of tens of thousands of victims in Afghanistan that are suffering from the consequences of war. This does not mean that we upright bring to court and tribunals all the culprits of human rights violations. It means that a transitional justice would provide ways and means to get to justice through reconciliation, through truth-telling, through coming together and asking for forgiveness, for example. To set up reparation mechanism for victims, and also to make sure that all parties to the conflict agrees on measures that prevent recurrence of crimes and human rights violations in the future. That's very important. We haven't had those kind of agreements in the past. So these are very, very important points to be considered, to be taken into consideration when we talk about the transitional justice. Yes, I agree that Taliban is coming from a completely different worldview. And they might not be, ready to understand and to grasp the concept of accountability and transitional justice. I also understand that the international community, the US, does not want any accountability mechanism to be in Afghanistan in place because the current administration opposed the ICC involvement in Afghanistan. But we have to understand that protection, promotion, and respect for human rights and addressing human rights violation is a shared responsibility both for Afghans and international community, because international community have been militarily involved and effectively in control in many parts in Afghanistan in the past 20 years or 18 years, sorry.
No, very good point. I think we've got a number of questions that are kind of lining up in the Q&A box now. So I thank you both for being open to taking my questions. And now I'm going to pick up some of the questions. We've got 5, and I think we can, we're still open for more to come in if anybody wants to add them, but I think we've got 30 minutes so we can address all of these questions, hopefully. I'm going to start with the first question, which is from Medina Talebi, who asks, and I'm going to direct this initially at Hamish, but Musa, I'm also inviting you to comment as well. I think it's easier to direct it to someone to begin with. How does the Taliban reconcile its alleged past instances of cooperation with ISIS-K, so the Islamic State in Khorasan province, which continues to execute terrorist attacks throughout the state while maintaining a favorable position at the negotiating table with the United States?
It's a great question, Medina. I think there are 3 elements to it. So, which is, have the Taliban been involved in terrorist type attacks? I think the answer to that is unambiguously yes, that there has been a series. I mean, some of the ones most recently have been amongst the most horrifying that I've ever seen. But the Taliban clearly have been involved in those attacks. They don't claim all of them, but there is a suicide bomb nexus in Kabul, which clearly has Haqqani network fingerprints all over it. And so you're right to make the basic point, as I presume you are, that America is negotiating with people with terrible blood on their hands. The Taliban will say, oh, well, the Americans do drone strikes, but I think it's very difficult to look at the range of attacks in Kabul and not be horrified and see the difference between that kind of behavior and even the most ill-advised drone strike, and there have been many. I think there's a second issue to your question, which is, are Islamic State and the Taliban linked? And I think Musa and I probably have a slightly different view on this. I do believe that the Taliban are in earnest enmity with ISKP, that their fighting has been real, that what cooperation there has been in the two organizations will have been very limited and local. It is certainly true, I think, that ISKP's first significant wing was in North Afghanistan and emerged from an internal Taliban dispute. I think it was a local commander who breached Taliban rule, and then in response to being effectively reprimanded, decided to fly the flag of ISKP. But that doesn't mean, that link, I don't think, means that there is an alliance. In fact, I believe pretty much the opposite. It is more, this is too much detail, but I think it's more complicated in Kabul, where I find it difficult to believe that Islamic State has generated the ability to conduct as complex attacks as they did so quickly in Kabul without some borrowing of Haqqani expertise. But I don't know quite what the mechanism would have been there, but I don't think it amounts to a strategic alliance between the two organizations. And I think the third prong of your question, which is really key, is, are the Taliban international terrorists? And I think the answer to that is that they are not, that they have always been domestically focused, but that they have a lot in common with international terrorists like Al-Qaeda, and that the links with Al-Qaeda have proven very difficult for them to break. So I think the true nature of Taliban Al-Qaeda cooperation at the moment is that the Taliban cannot publicly support anything to do with Al-Qaeda. The reverse is not true. Al-Qaeda are always quite keen to say how supportive they are of the Taliban, and that there are Al-Qaeda fighters in the country with links to the Taliban. But I don't think it's not a big strategic alliance. The Taliban isn't going to, I believe, in any of our lifetimes, attempt an attack on the West, or certainly outside of Afghanistan, Pakistan. However, that's not huge consolation for us, because Osama bin Laden planned 9/11 from Afghanistan, I believe, without any help from the Taliban. But the fact that he had a secure rear base to operate from was important in his ability to prosecute those attacks.
So Musa, the same question to you, but I guess given that Hamish implied you may have a difference of opinion, I guess I'm also asking, what is the relationship between the Taliban and ISKP? And then to go to Medina's question is, how does the Taliban reconcile this ostensible collaboration with the Islamic State while negotiating with the United States?
I think in Afghanistan, I'm reflecting the views of Afghans. We don't see much of difference between Taliban and ISKP. They are two names, but with the same ideology, the same tactics, the same brutalities, and the same way of attacking on and against civilians. So that doesn't make much difference between the two groups. Of course, their rivalries and feuds are over more territories and income generation and controlling some of the areas. That's inevitable. Even between Taliban, that happens over the collection of Ushur, which is Islamic taxation and other issues. So we should not really think that Taliban and ISKP are different ideologically, but they are two different names. And of course, ISKP is a branch of they call themselves so-called the ISIS. And I think Taliban, as I mentioned before, committed similar crimes and human rights violations as the ISKP is now claiming that they are responsible for, and they have not issued any declaration condemning of those attacks in the past, apparently, exceptions maybe for one or two, and they have not condemned their or denounced their approaches to against civilians in Afghanistan. And I think that remains a question. That's why, when for Afghans, the crimes is crime against people, it doesn't matter if it's committed by Taliban or ISIS or warlords. But the approach of the international community, unfortunately, has been different, and that makes me worried, because if Taliban succeed and negotiate with Afghan government and came to Kabul or to the cities, what will happen to the urban area left for other groups? If we do not focus on the rural areas, I think there is always a chance that ISKPs or other brands of terrorist groups or hardliners might infiltrate there. And look at the Khojagar issue. Now, it used to be a epicenter against Taliban. Now it's controlled almost by Taliban. So this is inevitable, and this is not because of Taliban or Mujahideen or ISKP. This is because of lack of governance and attention to the people's need in the rural areas, and addressing the differences between rural and urban divides in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just processing that. Let's switch to Samuel Ariz's question. And he says, "Hi Naysan, thank you so much for hosting a very informative talk." And his question is about Pakistan and their kind of regional position vis-a-vis peace negotiations and the outcomes. He says, "To the degree that the Biden administration will have to confront Pakistan, I was wondering if the panelists could address Pakistan's view of and agenda for the talks as they now stand. Or, to use the framing of this talk, who would Pakistan have endorsed for president on the limited basis of this issue of Afghanistan?" Hamish noted that the Taliban overestimate the degree to which they have moved beyond their poor reputation, left over from the 90s, even with Pakistan, China, etc. If Pakistan wants a power-sharing arrangement, what would this look like in their ideal world? So really, what is this? Who would Pakistan have supported in the elections with regard to Afghanistan? What would that ideal power-sharing arrangement look like? I'm going to put that to Musa first, please.
Well, Pakistan's role in Afghanistan has been always seen. I'm again talking from Afghans' point of view, destructive and very much guided by the rivalries between Pakistan and India in subcontinent and also in the region. And therefore, Pakistan have been always after a government that secure, as they called, the strategic depth of Pakistan in Afghanistan, and not be influenced by India, the arch enemy of Pakistan in the region. So in that regard, whatever it takes to strengthen an opposition to the government in Afghanistan, I think Pakistan will deploy it, and they have not been shy of saying that they have influenced over Taliban. They have provided sanctuaries. In fact, the Quetta Shura, Peshawar Shura, Karachi Shura, they all are in Pakistan, and we knew that Mullah Mansour was killed in Pakistani territory. But as Pakistan is favor on American administration, I think Pakistani have a very strong lobby in Washington and also in the European capitals, and they are very well trained and stationed in those areas to influence the administrations toward Afghanistan. Actually, they are regretting losing the guiding principles or tools of the U.S. Foreign policy towards Central Asia and Afghanistan. I think they are in attempt to get that one. And I see that they might work with Joe Biden because I think Joe Biden with his long-term relations with Pakistani knows Pakistan's, but we have to note that things have changed in that region, and Afghanistan could play much better partnership role with the US if everything is sorted out in that region than only looking at toward Afghanistan using the Pakistanis there. So I think I'm not aware of the Pakistan endorsing which one in the US, but I'm aware that Pakistan is always afraid of a strong government in Kabul, independent in its foreign policy and relations, and especially friendly towards India and some other Pakistani adversaries.
Thanks, Musa. Hamish, Pakistan's standpoint on Trump versus Biden and their ideal power sharing arrangement in Afghanistan.
It's a great question, Samuel. I think that I'm going to differ slightly with Musa here. I think that the Pakistanis pretty unambiguously would have wanted Trump to win because they remember the Obama administration as a very difficult time for their relations with America, and those relations improved under Trump. So I think they will be nervous seeing Biden come back onto the scene. It's worth saying that Biden knows the Pakistanis well, that he's had a lot of contact with them over the years. And I think familiarity has not necessarily bred enthusiasm. So I think that the Pakistanis will probably be slightly bracing themselves for what will probably return to a slightly more muscular American approach to Pakistan than we've seen under Trump. I mean, in terms of what do they want? I mean, I'm again going to disagree slightly with Musa, which is that I think that Pakistan has played a very repetitive game in Afghanistan, which is to try and use its intelligence services to buy influence with Afghanistan's insurgency. So it did it with the 5 jihadi parties against the Soviets, and it's doing it now with the Taliban against the Afghan government. I think it's a long-run error for Pakistan to have been so reliant on basically quite aggressive human intelligence techniques rather than having a wider diplomacy with Afghanistan. I think that they've ended up, particularly in relation to the Taliban, being seen in Afghanistan but nowhere else as being almost Pashtun chauvinist, in that they're supporting a movement which is seen as very Pashtun, and alienated all the other ethnic groups in Afghanistan away from them. I mean, the Pashtuns themselves are pretty alienated from the Pakistanis as well. And the Pashtuns obviously have a particular geographic grievance with Pakistan over the Durand line. So I think what would be in Pakistan's interest now would be using its influence over the Taliban to push for a more pluralist outcome to these negotiations as a way of trying to rebuild its links with the non-Pashtun forces in Afghanistan, and thereby try and limit India's influence in Afghanistan, which is primarily through the non-Pashtun ethnic groups. I don't believe they will do that, however, because I think that the army will not release its hold over Afghan policy. And as a consequence, it will look to the ISI for an answer, and the ISI's answer, the ISI is a brutal hammer, and it will see the same answer that it has always seen, which is pay off bits of the Taliban and maybe try and pay off bits of the Afghan government in order to have human intelligence relationships. I think it's a total catastrophe of a foreign policy for Pakistan, but it's one that they have been heavily invested in for 30 years.
Thanks. It's interesting to see the difference in perspectives there. Switching to a question from Professor Marcia Inhorn. Marcia, thanks for joining us. She says, and this kind of relates to some of the points you just touched on, Hamish. She says, after 20 years of US war in Afghanistan, the Taliban seems stronger than ever, in part because of the Trump's government's capitulations. But from where do the Taliban continue to gain support in terms of recruitment, funding, popular support, external support, and ethnic support? There's a sub-question there, are they still primarily Pashtun? Why do they continue to maintain so much power in Afghanistan? I'll put that to Musa first, please. Where does the Taliban get its support from, and why do they still maintain such a strong presence in Afghanistan?
Well, Taliban is a group that that we could say that was completely defeated in 2001, and they were nowhere in Afghanistan being seen, other than pleading and to join the new process. And most of them attended the emergency lawyer jirga, for example, those who were allowed, and some other were just happy to stay at home and not do anything. But unfortunately, some mistakes were made, and I don't go back to that. Hamish hinted to some of those mistakes, and also internationally, the war in Iraq encouraged, many of the jihadis to come back to Afghanistan and support Taliban to regroup and start fighting there. But they unfortunately become powerful because of many accounts. First, we could not, the international community and the Afghans could not effectively and speedily put a government in place to respond to the needs and grievances of all Afghans, both in the rural areas and also in the urban areas. Second, corruption, and the people become very much involved in corruption, and that corruption also helped Taliban to be paid to create scenes of insurgencies or insecurity, so these corrupt officials or contractors get more money. Third, they got a sanctuary in Pakistan and got a lot of support from Pakistanis and support from Gulf states, people and clergies in terms of fatwas and funding. So that helped them. I think the other mistake was that the increase of the troops of the United States in Afghanistan. They should not have done that, because that attracted more attention to Afghanistan, and it became a ground for Taliban to recruit more. But if you look at the current situation of Taliban or before, they are not as powerful as they look like. It is because we don't have a united government in Afghanistan. We don't have an effective institutions in Afghanistan, effective government. Look at every attacks that Taliban has so far carried out. They were repelled by Afghan army, and they could not hold any important grounds. But they have been able better in working with the rural areas, mobilizing them, and selling their narratives on the issue of Islam is in danger, occupation is there. And the government of Afghanistan, despite providing all those services, could not create a direct contact with the rural areas. Even Taliban used the collection of taxes like Ushur from the local areas as a way of relationship between the Taliban and the people in there. But Afghanistan government even could not do that. So the outside external support to Taliban, their experience in fighting, the mistakes of the international community, corruption and weak government institutions in Afghanistan caused the Taliban become more powerful, but they are not as powerful as they seem. So otherwise, they have, so far have made a big achievements in Afghanistan. And they are opposed by most of Afghans. Their base is broadly Pashtun, but they have been able to recruit from other ethnic groups recently. But those are only tactical support for Taliban as opposed to organic and natural support for Taliban in those areas.
Thanks, Musa. That was a very comprehensive answer. It was great. Hamish, anything to add?
Not really. I agree with everything that Musa has just said, in particular his emphasis on the sort of greater organizational effectiveness of the Taliban over the period compared to the Afghan government and the international community. And I agree too on what he has said about the growing non-Pashtun ethnic support for the Taliban. The only thing I would add to the professor's very good question is that in terms of funding for the Taliban, and I think Musa and I probably agree on this, I'm very skeptical about some of the more eye-popping reports that you see suggesting that the Taliban are making billions of dollars in revenue every year. I think that the truth is that the Taliban are primarily funded in relatively traditional Afghan ways, including usher, particularly from drug crops, but they're not. This is not a foreign. While it is true that they get foreign funding, I think from Pakistan, Iran, Russia, that's not a particularly significant investment, I think, compared to the financial support that they can draw from within Afghanistan, from the areas that they control.
Thanks, Hamish. We have 2 questions left, and I'm going to pick up the last question we have here from I assume they're both actually from the same anonymous attendee. The question I'm going to first focus on is the latter, which is, are there any specific diplomats that Biden could appoint who would be particularly adept at resolving the situation in Afghanistan? And the point is added, perhaps it's more of a mentality than a person, but are there individuals that could be taken on board? And I guess there's also implied in that is, does Zalmay Khalilzad have a role moving forward? I'll put that to Musa.
I think I agree that the approach must be changed in Afghanistan towards peace and negotiation, and the negotiation and peace must be supported, and that's a fact. And I think that's a right policy to support peace in Afghanistan. But in terms of the individuals, I think it would be inevitable to change the people because some of them have not become have become very polarized in Afghanistan and have not been able to generate support for the peace, especially among the government of Afghanistan. I think some of the individuals that are involved have created tension actually, and of course there are support also and friendship between many politicians in Afghanistan and Mr. Khalilzad, who is also has an Afghan origin. So there should be and might be a change in who is leading these efforts toward Afghanistan. But I think someone that is more thinking about a long-term, broader and comprehensive way of accommodating the needs of both Afghan government, people of Afghanistan, civil society and media, as well as the need of bringing this conflict to an end by encouraging and putting pressure on Taliban and Pakistan and other countries in the region that's to cooperate. So someone that's a politician and also a very sharp diplomat, I would say. I don't have any name on my list right now, but maybe Hamish could help with that if he has. Yeah.
It's a slightly inelegant question about who would be better than Zalmay Khalilzad. I mean, I think there are lots of people with, I think, a really good understanding of Afghanistan and the mixture of political and diplomatic interventions that could help to move the peace process towards a good position. I mean, I worked with Laurel Miller, who was the former special representative, who's a clever person and knowledgeable of the file. You could say the same about John Dempsey, Mervyn Patterson, Michael Semple. There are a range of Kate Clark. There are a range of excellent analysts, not all of whom are American, and I think the Biden administration will have a relatively deep reservoir of talent to draw on. But as Musa says, I think this is not, I don't think you could send any diplomat into the negotiations in Doha and expect on the basis of a changed person a different outcome. I think it requires a different policy mix and different things happening in Afghanistan itself to change the dynamic of the negotiations. I think, as we've seen in Eastern Europe this week, that in a position of where military forces is proving dominant, the negotiations are the tail rather than the dog. And I think that it's not just diplomatic changes that will be necessary.
Thank you, Hamish. Thank you to you both. The last question, Hamish, I know you touched on this before when you were giving your presentation, but again, from an anonymous attendee, it's a question about Western knowledge of the Taliban. Could either of the panelists please speak about how they believe Western governments truly understand the Taliban and their desires and influences? Is the Taliban a known quantity at this point? Or should there be more investment into intelligence gathering and/or constructive negotiations? Are they inevitable? Hamish, if you wanted to very, very quickly summarize what you said earlier and add anything, and then I'll just turn it over to Musa to close. And we have essentially a few minutes to do so.
It's a great question, anonymous person. It is, I think there was a lot of investment, intelligence investment into the Taliban, but largely sort of tactical targeting. Whereas I think what we missed was taking the Taliban's political currents, what the internal debate within the Taliban was, seriously, because we viewed them as so alien that it wasn't sort of worth the intelligence effort. I think that's a mistake. But I think there's a broader thing that we do need to learn from countries like Russia and Iran, and that is thinking about how you engage not just on an intelligence angle, but in terms of a wider influence angle, about how you seek to politically influence people who are quite different from you. And I know that sounds like quite an unattractive proposition, given how much we resent Russian and Iranian interference in various fields. But I think when we're talking about trying to change the political dial elsewhere, we do need to take people's internal politics seriously if we're to interact effectively.
Musa, any final comments to add to what Hamish has just said about the West's knowledge of the Taliban?
I think I agree with Hamish. We also should think about that. There are some confusion that we see from Afghan point of view, that the West has dealt with Taliban in a completely different ways, while they have designated a section of Taliban as a terrorist and the other section is not in the terrorist list. For example, different engagement with them. Eventually this February Doha agreement signed between the Americans and Taliban. This shows that there is a lack of understanding about Taliban and the machinery of Taliban. But for Afghans, as Afghan, I think there are understanding of Taliban. Taliban is a destructive force, a machinery to resort to violence to achieve their goals, and they have been committing and resorting to a lot of terrorist activities in Afghanistan and harming a lot of people. And they have to and must stop their terrorist activities and targeting civilians. And I think it's a better way for them to live alongside Afghanistan, and especially when Afghanistan constitution guaranteed equality between men and women and all Afghan citizens, and that's a venue for all of Afghans to coexist and live side by side.
Well said, well said. A great point to conclude on. I just want to say thank you to the audience for their excellent questions. I want to thank the folks at CMES and the Yale Program of Iranian Studies that put this together and have allowed this to happen. And just to finish, to thank both of our speakers today. I mean, people always give platitudes, but I think that for me, this has been one of the most informative and most exciting panels that I've been involved with. And to do this over to do it online in what I think has been a successful manner. I just want to say thank you very much for your expertise and sharing that with us today. I'm sure everyone wants to thank you. And goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.